It is April 2026, and for key American industries, a countdown has begun. Production lines for everything from cars to critical defense components could grind to a halt in less than 30 days. This isn't just inflation. It's a physical shortage of a foundational industrial metal, aluminum. Right now, U.S. Midwest premiums are at a record $2,525 per ton over the global benchmark, a raw signal of extreme scarcity. When a nation depends on imports for 60% of its aluminum, any supply interruption doesn't create a slow squeeze. It triggers a countdown. Inventories are collapsing and there is no quick fix. But how did we get here? This entire crisis, this precise moment of industrial vulnerability, can be traced back to a single policy decision. And to understand it, we need to rewind the clock. To understand that 30-day countdown to industrial shutdown, we have to rewind to the moment the clock was set. Before the crisis, before the shortages, there was a system. You have to understand, the US and Canada didn't just trade aluminum. It functioned more like a single, deeply integrated industrial system stretched across a border, not two separate economies negotiating. The scale of this integration was massive. In 2024, the year before the break, Canada exported approximately $14 billion worth of aluminum. 94% of that flowed directly south into the American manufacturing heartland. It was efficient, stable, and for decades utterly predictable. Then Washington slammed the brakes. On March 12, 2025, the U.S. government imposed Section 232 tariffs, starting at 25% on Canadian aluminum. By June, that figure had escalated to a staggering 50%. This wasn't a minor trade adjustment. It was an economic wall erected overnight, shattering the foundation of this continental relationship. And this is where policy written in a capital city collides with physical reality. A 50% tariff sounds like a line in a policy document, but in the world of industrial logistics, it behaves like a pressure valve being slammed shut on a critical artery. Instantly, Canadian aluminum became uneconomical for its biggest and closest customer. The system didn't bend, it broke. Washington had just built an economic wall against its closest ally. The conventional playbook dictated that Canada would protest, negotiate, and eventually buckle under the pressure. But Canada didn't follow the playbook. They did something Washington never saw coming. What Washington failed to anticipate was not a political counter-move, but a cold, rational business calculation. Faced with a 50% tariff wall, Canadian producers didn't protest or negotiate. They simply pivoted. The destination had a precise logic: Europe. For years, the European Union had been building a regulatory framework, including its carbon border tax, that placed a high premium on one specific commodity, low-carbon aluminum. And Canada's smelters, powered almost entirely by Quebec's hydroelectricity, produced exactly that. The American policy had unintentionally made Canada's green aluminum far more valuable to a different, equally large market. A perfect match was made not by diplomats, but by spreadsheets. This shift was not a slow migration. It was a structural rewiring of a global trade artery that had been stable for decades. Here is where policy fantasy collides with industrial reality. The data is unequivocal. According to S&P Global Market Intelligence, in the first quarter of 2025, a full 95% of Quebec's aluminum exports went to the United States. By the second quarter, just 3 months later, that number had fallen to 78%. That displaced volume didn't just disappear. Europe's share skyrocketed from a negligible 0.2% and 18% in the exact same period. This kind of movement in global trade is not incremental. It is structural, meaning the system itself is being rewired. Industry analysts now call this the $18 billion structural shift. New long-term contracts were signed, locking in this new transatlantic flow, enabled by zero tariff access under the CETA trade agreement. A policy designed to contain an industry had instead created a more profitable, more secure alternative for its target. On the surface, this was a strategic masterstroke, a textbook example of industrial judo. But this isn't the whole story, because the true cost of this pivot was quietly being paid, not by the policymakers in Washington, but by businesses and supply chains right back here in Canada. The success created a new hidden vulnerability that almost no one saw coming. Strategic pivot looked like a masterstroke, a textbook example of industrial judo. But this story of a clean Canadian win is deceptively simple. The reality on the ground for thousands of Canadian businesses and workers was far more painful. Here's where policy fantasy collides with industrial reality. While Canada's large primary aluminum producers successfully rerouted their metal to Europe, they are only the first link in a much longer chain. The rest of that chain, our own downstream manufacturers who turn raw aluminum into car parts, window frames, and consumer goods, was left exposed. They are part of the same highly integrated North American supply chain that was just deliberately fractured by American policy. The economic shockwaves didn't stop at the border. They traveled north and hit these businesses directly. The numbers tell the real story. According to RBC Economics, between January and September 2025, while primary aluminum output fell by only 2%, Canadian downstream manufacturing output plummeted by 14%. That's the hidden damage. This isn't an abstract number. This was felt in communities across the country. The Union Unifor documented temporary layoffs and plant idlings at facilities like Stellantis' Windsor and Brampton plants, tying them directly to the uncertainty and higher material costs driven by the tariffs. The cost of this disruption was ultimately transferred directly onto Canadian households. An analysis by the Fulcrum estimated the tariff cycle cut Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%, imposing an invisible tax of between $1,100 and $2,000 in higher annual costs on the average family. This reveals the inescapable mechanics of trade wars. When your largest partner implements a disruptive policy, you pay the price, one way or another. But all of this, the fractured supply chains, the job losses, the pivot to Europe, it all begs one obvious central question. Why didn't the tariffs just work? Why couldn't America simply make its own aluminum? The answer isn't in a policy document. It's in the laws of physics. That answer is found in one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes on the planet. It's helpful to stop thinking of aluminum as a metal and instead think of it as solid electricity. It's a physical battery for storing immense amounts of power. This brings us to the central fatal flaw of the entire policy. The numbers themselves tell the story. To produce a single metric ton of primary aluminum, you need approximately 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. That figure is a constant, dictated by chemistry and physics. The only variable is the cost of that power. Here is where the policy collides with non-negotiable economic reality. In Quebec, Canadian smelters benefit from some of the cheapest hydropower in the world, costing between $26 and $41 per megawatt hour. By contrast, the average industrial electricity rate in the United States is over $65 per megawatt hour. This isn't a minor discrepancy. It's a fundamental cost gap of 30 to 50% or even more. No tariff, no matter how high, can erase that reality. This single factor explains why countries like Canada, Norway, and Iceland dominate primary aluminum production. Their strategic advantage isn't raw material. It's access to massive, low-cost, and reliable electricity, primarily from hydropower. The American policy was therefore fighting an unwinnable war against the laws of economics. The political fantasy of a revitalized made-in-America aluminum sector ran headfirst into the industrial physics of the energy grid. Instead of reviving the industry, the policy simply confirmed its decline. The number of operating primary aluminum smelters in the U.S., which stood at 33 in 1980, fell to a historic low of just 4 to 6 by 2025, with most running well below their actual capacity. With domestic production proven to be an impossibility, the United States still had to fill the massive supply gap it had created by pushing away Canadian aluminum. A choice had to be made. The choice it landed on solved the immediate problem, but in doing so, it traded a predictable neighbor for a geopolitical time bomb. And that geopolitical time bomb wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical place. The Strait of Hormuz, with domestic production failing to ramp up in its most reliable supplier, Canada, now redirecting its low-carbon aluminum to Europe. The United States had a massive supply gap to fill. The choice it made would set the stage for the current crisis. By 2026, America had turned to suppliers in the Middle East, primarily the UAE and Bahrain, to replace the lost Canadian volume. These nations came to account for nearly 20% of all U.S. aluminum imports. Here we must pause and be precise about the nature of this exchange. The U.S. didn't just swap one supplier for another, it swapped one kind of reality for another. It traded a stable, predictable, land-based supply chain with a neighbor for a volatile, transoceanic one dependent on a single point of failure. The Canadian supply chain is an integrated continental network of rail and road. The new one was a fragile thread stretching 8,000 miles across an ocean, with every ton of metal forced through one of the world's most dangerous geopolitical choke points. This is where policy fantasy collides with industrial reality. The fantasy was that aluminum is a fungible commodity, that a ton from the UAE is identical to a ton from Quebec. The industrial reality is that geography is a non-negotiable part of the supply chain. How a material gets to you matters more than anything. The new system appeared to work, but it was inherently fragile. As the old wisdom goes, the system works until it does not. And when it stops, the consequences move very quickly. The risk was no longer about tariffs with an ally. It was about war in a global flashpoint. They had planted a time bomb in the heart of their own supply chain. They had replaced a stable, land-based supply chain with a fragile, transoceanic one dependent on that single choke point. In April 2026, that choke point closed. What happened next was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. In March and April of 2026, the theoretical risk of the Strait of Hormuz became a brutal, physical reality. The time bomb we had all watched being set finally went off. Amid an escalating regional conflict, Iranian strikes didn't just target military assets. They targeted the economic engine of their rivals. And that engine was now directly connected to the American industrial base. The news came in fragments at first. Reports from S&P Global and the Times of Israel confirming direct hits on two of the world's largest smelters, the Emirates Global Aluminium Facility, EGA Al Tawila in the UAE, and the Aluminium Bahrain plant, known as ALBA. These weren't abstract targets on a map. These were the very factories the United States had chosen as its new primary suppliers. A policy decision made in Washington had just materialized as smoke rising from a factory 8,000 miles away. The consequences were not delayed. They were immediate. Shipments were halted. Insurance for tankers became impossible to secure. The choke point, through which nearly 20% of America's new aluminum supply now flowed, was sealed. The countdown that started with the tariffs had just hit zero. This is where the fantasy of a perfectly fungible global market collides with the hard physics of a supply chain. You can't just reroute a factory. You can't just wish aluminum into existence. Panic hit the buyers. Bloomberg reported that major producers like Rio Tinto and Century Aluminum didn't even wait for a market correction. They immediately hiked their premiums for semi-processed aluminum by 12%. It was a clear signal. The metal was no longer available at any reasonable price. Within weeks, market analysts like Steve Hanke were charting a price surge of over 83% year over year. This wasn't an unpredictable black swan. This was the direct, foreseeable, and calculated result of a choice. The choice to trade a stable, integrated land-based supplier for a fragile, distant maritime one. The bill for that decision had finally come due. The immediate crisis, the price spikes, that's what fills the headlines, and eventually it will be managed. But the headlines miss the real story. The temporary shock to the market isn't the true damage. The lasting cost is something quieter and far more permanent, the fragmentation of the North American industrial base itself, a structural break in a continental system that was built over decades, a break that, as we are about to see, may be irreversible. This break is irreversible for a simple commercial reason. Canada has moved on. We aren't talking about a temporary rerouting of a few cargo ships. We are witnessing a structural realignment of an entire industrial ecosystem, locked in by new multi-year contracts with European buyers. These buyers need Canada's low-carbon aluminum to meet their own stringent climate policy goals. As economic analysts have stated, this isn't a temporary blip. It's a permanent pivot. The logistics have been reconfigured. The old integrated North American system, built over half a century, is broken. For good. And here is where the policy fantasy collides with industrial reality. The intended outcome was a stronger America. The actual outcome is a weaker continent. The United States has willfully severed its connection to its most stable and secure source of a critical industrial metal. In its place, it has accepted a permanent state of higher costs and supply fragility. While Canada has found new markets, it has lost the immense scale and stability of the integrated continental system. Our industrial future is now tied more closely to the shifting winds of transatlantic politics. The causal chain is clear. The U.S. tariff forced a Canadian pivot, which was then locked in by European demand. The final result is diminished strategic autonomy for both of us. This leaves Washington facing an acute dilemma. Option 1, admit the strategic error and attempt to repair a relationship with a supplier who no longer prioritizes them. Or option 2, double down on the policy and accept a permanently fragmented industrial base, managing the higher costs and risks as the new normal. This entire saga serves as a blueprint for how continental supply chains fracture, a cautionary tale of how a policy, born from a simplified fantasy of protectionism, creates the harsh reality of strategic erosion. The question now is what we learn from this. This story is a template for failure. What other critical Canadian industries do you see that are vulnerable to this same kind of policy shock from a key partner? Whether it's agriculture, rare earth minerals, or pharmaceuticals, share your thoughts below. If you value deep dives that connect complex policy to real-world impact, subscribe for more.